CZ Shadow 2 trigger mechanism explained in 10 minutes or less. So these are the components of the trigger mechanism on the CZ Shadow 2, CZ Shadow 1, SPO1. These components, these systems is shared across multiple CZ handguns that use the double action trigger. The SPO1 as an exception has what's called a firing pin block that is not represented here because it's not present in the Shadow 2 or Shadow 1 guns. But except from the firing pin block, everything else is the same, even on the SPO1. So let's talk about each of these components and how they influence individually the trigger pull and the trigger feel. Having said that, the first components we're going to talk about is the trigger return spring and the trigger shoe. The trigger return spring, the spring that you see in the picture here, this function is to return the trigger to the original position. So once you pull the trigger, something needs to push that trigger back to the original position. So therefore, when you're pulling the trigger, you're going against that spring. So using the reduced power return spring will reduce some of the weight in the trigger pull. The trade-off on that is that with a weaker spring, you get a slightly lighter trigger pull, but you're going to have a less tactile reset as well. So you have to balance out the fact that you get a lighter trigger pull with a weaker reset. The next thing is the trigger shoe, and the first thing for us to notice there is the geometry between that hole in the trigger shoe and the hole in the trigger bar. They're connected via a pin, and this creates a, depending on the geometry that you have there and how that hole is aligned to the rest of the trigger and trigger bow, it creates a different lever system, which will create a different feel and different weight in the trigger as well. It's not very significant, but it is different. Then the trigger face, the shape of the face of the trigger shoe there also makes a difference. Depending on how curved, if it's more curved, less curved, if it's flat, semi-flat, all these different shapes will create different feels and potentially different trigger weights as well. There are different reach and other things that we need to take in consideration when we talk about that shape. The last thing about the trigger shoe is the set screw. So the OEM trigger has that one set screw that controls the post travel, and that adjusts like how much the trigger goes beyond the break point. And some aftermarket triggers will have a pre-travel control as well, so an additional set screw on the top of the face of the trigger shoe that controls kind of adjust the amount of slack you have in double action, and it can reduce the reach of the trigger a little bit too. Next component we're going to talk about is the trigger bow and the trigger bow spring. Here it's all about friction. So you got friction between the bow and the trigger shoe. You had friction between the bow and the slide on those bumps there. You have friction between the trigger bow spring and the trigger bow. Underneath the trigger bow, you have a pair of rails that the trigger bow spring is supposed to ride on, and it's normally very rough. So it can benefit from some polishing there. It will give you a much better trigger feel if you have that area polished. The next is this friction with the sear and the disconnector, particularly in double action. All these areas can be polished and will benefit somehow, give you a better trigger pull. It's all about feel and a lot less about trigger weight. In my experience, the trigger weight by doing all this work here is really marginal. You might have some friction between the side of the trigger bow and the frame. That goes from gun to gun. Some guns you can benefit from some polishing there, and some other guns they're not even touching, so it will make no difference. So the next components I'm going to cover here is the sear and the sear spring. So the sear spring controls the pressure, the force that the sear engage with the hammer. Therefore, the lighter you go with that spring, if you use a reduced power sear spring, you're gonna have a little bit of a lighter trigger pull as well, only noticeable in single action. You probably won't notice anything in double action. The trade-off here is that less pressure between the sear and the hammer can cause some issues depending on how much you go in that direction. The engagement or the pressure between the sear and the hammer must be really positive to prevent your hammer to fall unexpectedly. And also, there is a safety feature, a second set of hooks in your hammer in case your hammer falls unexpectedly without you pulling the trigger, of course. Your trigger is your sear rather is gonna ride in that area of the hammer until it hits the second set of hooks, and will catch the hammer there and prevent the hammer to fall completely and hit firing pin and then the gun to fire. That safety feature will only work if there is enough pressure in the sear. So if you go too light with the sear spring, you can make your sear be light enough that you won't have a positive engagement with the hammer enough to be safe. Next is the engagement itself between the hammer and the sear. So how those two parts interact with each other. Your hammer hook's engaging with the nose of the sear. So independently of the sear spring, how those two parts, what is the geometry between those two parts engaging with each other. Before we move on, I'm gonna say that I would strongly recommend you not to play with that unless you know very well what you're doing or you're an experienced or professional gunsmith, because the benefit, the risk of something going wrong there surpasses by a lot the benefit. So the benefit of doing so, of playing with that geometry, make sure you have the best, everything is a square angle and everything is right there on your with the hooks of your hammer, is to remove creep, make a more defined wall, and that's how you're gonna go with those, under sub 1 pound triggers, right? It is that engagement between the hammer and the sear that determines that, and that's gonna be really single action. In double action, it makes no difference. Next is the disconnector. So the disconnector is this part here that you don't see on a single action gun. So Tactical Sports 2, Orange, the Checkmate, even a Shadow 2 when it's converted into single action, you shouldn't see a disconnector there. It's only used in a double action pull. So the disconnector is going to have some friction with the trigger ball, and you can benefit. You can get some a little bit smoother trigger if you polish those areas where they contact each other. It's that each side of the trigger ball in those areas, and that tab on the disconnector. The OEM has 2 tabs, one on each side. Some aftermarket disconnectors have a tab just on one side. You have to be careful with polishing those areas because there's also a geometry thing there. The contact between the trigger ball and the disconnector is what kind of makes the hammer fall in double action. So if you cut enough material there and alter the angle, the geometry there, you might make your hammer fall prematurely and then your gun won't fire. The next thing is this edge of the disconnector here. So if you visualize that hook-shaped face of the disconnector and how it engages with the trigger ball and that valley in the center, the disconnector is used for when the hammer is cocked, is pulled back, it pulls the trigger ball and consequently the trigger as well. That hook, that face of the disconnector touching the trigger ball also determines how much forward the trigger go when it's resting in double action and how much pre-travel you got in single action. So the ideal operation there is you got an aftermarket oversized disconnector in that area that will probably not work initially in your gun. It will prevent your gun will work in double action, but the oversized disconnector there is going to prevent your gun to reset in single action. And then you remove material just enough to have that perfect reset in single action with no slack whatsoever, and it also reduces the reach of your trigger in double action. The OEM comes, there's not much you can do with the OEM one because it comes sized like with a minimum size, favoring reliability in the sense that your trigger is going to work 100% and it's going to reset 100% of the times, but there will be more slack and longer reach than you really need. Next component, and the last one here, is the mainspring or hammer spring. That's the spring that gets compressed when your hammer is being cocked, and then it disperses all that energy at once when you pull the trigger, which then makes your hammer fall, heats the firing pin with all that energy, transfer that energy to, firing pin hits the primer ignites, gun fires. So it's basically one of the easiest upgrades you can do is replace that spring by a lighter one, and it's gonna give you a great benefit because 99% of the force that you're doing in double action when you're pulling the trigger, it's actually to beat that spring, is to compress that spring. So the lighter that spring is, the lighter your trigger pull is going to be in double action. In single action, it doesn't make a lot of difference. Single action is more about the hammer and sear engagement than anything else. But in double action, it's definitely the mainspring that's going to make the biggest difference there. And it's a relatively easy upgrade. All you have to do is remove the grip panels, the one spring cup, and a couple pins, and you can replace that spring. The trade-off on it is if you go too light, then you start having an issue we call light strike, which is your hammer doesn't hit the firing pin with enough energy now to beat the firing pin spring, and then hit the primer with enough energy to ignite it. If that's the case, then you need to go on and do other modifications like install an extended firing pin or reduced power firing pin spring, things of that nature to increase reliability. But you could go like, I believe the OEM mainspring on a Shadow 2, it's something I think between 15 and 17 pounds. You can go all the way down to 13 and a half or 13 pounds and still be really pretty reliable. The other way to go here is to use softer primers as well if you're more in the competition side. But For just regular, factory ammo, you do just fine with a 13-pound spring, and it's gonna make already a big difference. Reduce maybe a pound, pound and a half, 2 pounds even on your double action pull. So now that we've reviewed every component and how each one of them individually influences on trigger feel and trigger pull weight, we can understand that the total trigger pull weight is going to be a function of all these individual components together. I highlighted there the number one component being the trigger return spring and number six component being the main spring as kind of the biggest influencers or the biggest impact you can have on both trigger weight and trigger feel. And when you're doing your upgrades and you're doing your modifications, on that formula out there, the size of the number is kind of in my assessment, also the impact that you have in feel and trigger pull weight. So this is it. This is trigger mechanism explained in a little bit more than 10 minutes, but I hope it's been useful for you guys, and I'll talk to you again in the next video. Thank you so much.